The photograph measures 8 inches by 10 inches, glass negative cradled in tissue paper that crumbled to dust when Dr. Sarah Chen lifted it from the auction box on March 14, 2019. 3 young black women in borrowed silk dresses, photographed sometime in the 1850s, seated in a studio with painted backdrops of Greek columns that fooled no one. Their faces are composed, unsmiling in the way all daguerreotype subjects were told to hold still for the long exposure. But their hands tell a different story. Each woman's fingers rest on her lap in the same deliberate pattern. Thumb and forefinger locked together, forming a circle. Remaining 3 fingers splayed at precise angles that have nothing to do with comfort or natural repose. In the bottom right corner, barely visible until Chen held the glass to the light, someone had etched the number 47 with a jeweler's tool. The studio ledger listed them only as house servants. The photographer's name was Josiah Wheelwright, a northern transplant who kept 2 sets of books and died under circumstances the Charleston coroner declined to investigate too closely. 3 women, 1 gesture, a number that would take Chen 6 months to decode. The storage unit in Raleigh, North Carolina smelled of mildew and old cardboard, the kind of decay that settles over forgotten things when no living relative claims them. Dr. Sarah Chen had driven 3 hours from Durham University on a graduate student's tip that an estate auction might contain Civil War-era photographic materials. She was writing her dissertation on visual documentation of enslaved labor in the antebellum South, and she needed primary sources that hadn't been sanitized by museum curation or family mythology. The box sat in the back corner of Unit 17, beneath a stack of 1970s National Geographic magazines and a broken sewing machine. Someone had written "Old Pictures Fragile" in marker across the cardboard lid, then apparently decided the contents weren't worth preserving. Chen paid $47 for the entire lot, a detail she would later find darkly appropriate. Inside were 63 glass plate negatives, most of them cracked or clouded beyond recovery. Plantation houses, white families in Sunday clothes. A few images of enslaved workers posed beside cotton bales or standing at respectful distances behind their owners. Standard iconography of Southern prosperity, the visual grammar of a civilization built on brutality but determined to photograph itself as genteel. The portrait of the 3 women was different. Chen noticed it immediately when she spread the plates across her dining room table that evening, protective gloves on her hands, LED lamp angled to reveal detail without heat damage. The women were young, perhaps 18 or 19 years old. They wore dresses too fine for field workers, the kind of garments house servants might borrow for special occasions when white families wanted to display their wealth through the appearance of their property. But the photographer had posed them with unusual dignity. They sat in 3 matching chairs, not standing behind white subjects or arranged as decorative accessories. They looked directly at the camera with expressions Chen couldn't quite read. Not defiant, not submissive, watchful, and their hands were wrong. Chen had examined hundreds of period photographs. She knew how people naturally held themselves during long exposures, how discomfort showed in shoulders and necks, how subjects fidgeted despite instructions to remain still. But these 3 women had positioned their fingers with mathematical precision, each hand forming the exact same configuration, as if they'd rehearsed the gesture until muscle memory made it automatic. She pulled out her magnifying loupe and examined each hand in sequence. Left woman, right hand on lap. Thumb pressed to forefinger, forming a closed circle. Middle finger extended straight up. Ring finger bent at the second knuckle. Pinky slightly curved. Center woman, both hands visible. Identical gesture mirrored on each palm. Right woman, left hand. The same pattern again, with variations so slight they had to be intentional. The ring finger on her right hand bent at a different angle. The pinky on the center woman's left hand extended slightly farther. This wasn't relaxation. This was communication. Chen photographed the glass plate with her digital camera, importing the image to her laptop and opening it in enhancement software. The studio backdrop came into sharper focus. Painted columns, a balustrade, fake drapery meant to suggest classical architecture and old money. In the bottom right corner, nearly invisible against the dark portion of the negative, someone had scratched a number into the glass itself. 47. She zoomed in until the etching filled her screen. The strokes were deliberate, made with a sharp tool after the photograph was developed. Not damage, not accident. Someone had marked this image the way you'd mark inventory or code a file. Chen pulled up the auction documentation. The storage unit had belonged to a man named Harold Vickers, deceased at age 92 with no living children. His estate listed him as a retired insurance adjuster who'd spent 40 years collecting Civil War memorabilia. The photographic plates had been part of a larger lot purchased from an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina in 1978. Before that, the trail went cold, but the back of one cracked negative still bore a paper label, partially legible under magnification. J. Wheelwright Studio, King Street, Charleston, SC. And beneath that, in faded pencil, House Servants, Ravenswood Plantation, June 1854. The photographer's name. Chen opened her laptop and began searching historical databases for Josiah Wheelwright. The South Carolina Historical Society archives returned 3 results. A GI business license for a daguerreotype studio on King Street, issued 1852. A brief mention in the Charleston Mercury newspaper, 1855, advertising portraits of distinguished families and their households, and a death notice from 1859. J. Wheelwright, photographer, age 41, died suddenly of causes unknown. Funeral private. Died suddenly. Causes unknown. The language newspapers used when suicide or scandal made the truth unprintable. Chen made coffee and settled in for a long night. Something about the photograph nagged at her beyond academic curiosity. The women's faces stayed with her. The precision of their hands. The number 47 etched like a promise or a warning. She didn't know yet that she was looking at 3 women who'd been dead for 165 years, but had left a message that would unravel a conspiracy spanning 2 states and a network of people who'd gambled everything on coded gestures and borrowed silk dresses. Dr. Chen spent the next week treating the glass negatives with archival-grade chemicals, trying to recover detail from the damaged plates. Most were beyond salvation, but she managed to restore partial images from 11 additional photographs. More plantation scenes, white families, enslaved workers photographed as background decoration or proof of property. None showed the hand gesture from the 3 women's portrait. She contacted colleagues who specialized in 19th century visual culture. Dr. Marcus Webb at the Smithsonian examined her digital scans and confirmed the photographs dated to the mid-1850s based on the type of glass used and the chemical composition of the emulsion. He noted that Wheelwright's studio had operated during a brief window when daguerreotypes were being replaced by the wet collodion process, which allowed photographers to create glass plate negatives instead of unique images on silver-coated copper. Wheelwright was technically proficient, Webb wrote in his email response, but he wasn't particularly successful commercially. His studio closed in 1857, 2 years before his death. Most Charleston families preferred the more established photographers who'd been in business since the 1840s. Chen filed that detail away. A struggling photographer with a studio that closed early, a man who died under unclear circumstances, northern-born in a city increasingly hostile to anyone suspected of abolitionist sympathies. She began searching for information about Ravenswood Plantation. South Carolina tax records from 1854 listed it as a rice-producing estate 12 miles west of Charleston, owned by a man named Thaddeus Marchand. The property encompassed 800 acres along the Ashley River. Marchand owned 43 enslaved workers, according to the 1850 census, a number that had increased to 51 by 1860. Chen requested copies of the plantation's records from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. What arrived 3 weeks later was a disappointment. Incomplete tax documents, a few scattered receipts, a property deed. Marchand had apparently kept minimal records, or those records had been destroyed during the Civil War when Union forces occupied the area. But buried in a folder of miscellaneous documents, Chen found something that made her hands shake as she lifted it from the archival box. A handwritten inventory dated June 20th, 1854. 2 days after the photograph, the list documented household servants suitable for hire to Charleston families during social season. 3 names appeared under that heading: Delilah, age 19. Patience, age 18. Grace, age 18. Beside each name, someone had written seamstress, literate. The word jumped off the page. Teaching enslaved people to read and write had been illegal in South Carolina since 1834. The law imposed fines and whipping for any slave caught with books, and severe penalties for anyone who taught them. Yet here was documentation that 3 young women on Ravenswood Plantation could read, cataloged as casually as their sewing skills. Chen photographed the inventory page and enhanced the image on her computer. The handwriting was precise, almost clerical. But in the margin beside Grace's name, someone had added a small notation in different ink. A number, 47. The same number etched into the photograph. She began searching for references to those 3 names in runaway slave advertisements. The grim newspaper notices that offered rewards for the capture and return of escaped workers. The digital archive of Charleston newspapers yielded nothing for Delilah, Patience, or Grace from Ravenswood Plantation. No advertisements describing them as fugitives. No rewards offered for their recovery. Either they'd never tried to run, or they'd succeeded so completely that Thaddeus Marchand had never bothered to pursue them. Chen shifted her research to northern newspapers, particularly those with known abolitionist sympathies. The New York Tribune, the Liberator out of Boston, the Pennsylvania Freeman. She was looking for any mention of escaped slaves from South Carolina arriving in free states during 1854 or 1855. What she found instead was a letter to the editor published in the Pennsylvania Freeman on October 12, 1854. The writer identified himself only as a friend to freedom and described a new development in the network of safe houses and contacts that helped enslaved people escape to the north. "We have received intelligence," the letter read, "that certain sympathetic souls in the slave states are now using photographic portraiture as a means of identification. Fugitives arrive at our stations carrying no papers, for such documents would condemn them if intercepted. But they bear in their memories the faces of contacts they have never met, studied from photographs passed along invisible channels. A woman in Philadelphia may recognize a conductor in Ohio because she was shown his likeness in a Charleston parlor. The peculiar institution arms itself with hounds and chains. but we arm ourselves with images and codes. Chen read the letter 3 times. Photographic portraiture as identification. Images passed along invisible channels. The letter was vague enough to avoid giving authorities useful information, but specific enough to confirm that abolitionists were experimenting with visual communication networks. She returned to the photograph of the 3 women. Their borrowed dresses, their direct gazes, their hands forming gestures that had nothing to do with comfort or chance. This wasn't a simple portrait of house servants. This was enrollment documentation. These women were being photographed for a purpose. Their images intended for people who would need to recognize them or to identify themselves to the women as trusted contacts. The hand gestures were recognition codes, and the number 47 wasn't an inventory mark. It was an index. These 3 women were entry number 47 in some larger system. Chen needed to find out what that system was, who ran it, and whether any record of it had survived the war and the 165 years since someone photographed 3 women who decided to bet their lives on borrowed dresses and coded hands. Chen's dissertation advisor, Dr. Raymond Cole, listened to her findings with the skeptical patience of a scholar who'd watched too many graduate students chase conspiracy theories into academic dead ends. They sat in his cramped office at Durham University, surrounded by filing cabinets stuffed with microfilm and the particular smell of old books that never quite leaves historical archives. "You're suggesting," Cole said slowly, "that this photographer, Josiah Wheelwright, was running a covert documentation operation for the Underground Railroad. That he photographed enslaved women using hand signals as recognition codes, and that someone maintained an indexed ledger of these photographs, numbered sequentially." "I'm saying the evidence suggests it's possible," Chen replied. "The timing fits. The geographic location fits. Wheelwright was northern-born, his studio failed commercially, and he died under suspicious circumstances just 4 years after opening his business. The women in the photograph are documented as literate, which was illegal, and the hand gesture appears nowhere else in period photography I've examined." Cole leaned back in his chair. "The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, Sarah. You haven't found other photographs showing this gesture because you've examined maybe 300 images out of the hundreds of thousands produced in that era. And even if Wheelwright had abolitionist sympathies, photographing enslaved women in recognition codes would have been suicidally dangerous. Charleston in the 1850s was a powder keg. White vigilance committees were searching homes, opening mail, interrogating anyone suspected of anti-slavery sentiment. A northern photographer creating documentary evidence of an escape network would have lasted weeks, not years. Unless he was careful, Chen said. Unless the system was designed to be invisible. Look at the photograph again. If you don't know what you're looking for, it's just 3 women in borrowed dresses. The hand position looks natural enough. The number 47 is microscopic, invisible without magnification. And if the photographs were distributed outside Charleston, if they went straight to northern contacts, Wheelwright wouldn't have needed to keep copies in his studio. The glass plates we found might have been rejects or backups, hidden away and forgotten. Cole picked up the enhanced image Chen had printed. He studied it in silence for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. "You know what you're proposing has implications beyond your dissertation. If this documentation exists, if there's a numbered ledger of enslaved people who worked with the Underground Railroad, it would be one of the most significant archival finds in decades. It would also paint targets on the descendants of everyone involved. There are families in South Carolina who've spent 150 years pretending their ancestors didn't own slaves, or that the ones they did own were well treated. Documentary proof of active resistance would complicate those comfortable lies. I know, Chen said. But if these 3 women took the risk to be photographed, if they trusted Wheelwright enough to let him document their involvement in an escape network, don't we owe it to them to tell their story? Cole set the image down. First, you need more evidence. 1 photograph and 1 inventory list aren't enough. You need corroboration. Find other images with the same hand gesture. Find references to the number 47 in abolitionist correspondence. Find out what happened to Delilah, Patience, and Grace. Did they run? Did they stay? Did they help others escape? Without those answers, you're building a dissertation on speculation. Chen knew he was right. She also knew that the kind of evidence Cole wanted might not exist. The Underground Railroad had operated through deliberate secrecy. Records were destroyed. Names were changed. People who helped enslaved workers escape kept quiet about it for the rest of their lives. Because even after the Civil War, even after emancipation, admitting you'd broken the law could still bring consequences. She left Cole's office and walked across campus to the university library, where the special collections housed one of the largest repositories of abolitionist correspondence in the Southeast. If Wheelwright had been part of an organized network, someone might have mentioned him in letters or journals. The people who ran the Underground Railroad documented their work despite the danger, because they believed history would vindicate them. Chen requested access to the William Still papers. Still had been a clerk for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and had kept meticulous records of fugitive slaves who passed through Philadelphia on their way to Canada and freedom. His journal had been published in 1872 as The Underground Railroad, one of the few contemporary accounts written by someone directly involved in the network. She spent 6 hours reading through Still's entries, tracking patterns. He recorded physical descriptions, names, former owners, escape routes. He noted which conductors and stations were reliable. He documented close calls and successful arrivals. And occasionally, he mentioned identification methods. In an entry from November 1854, Still wrote about a woman who'd escaped from Georgia. She arrived with instructions to identify herself to contacts by touching her right hand to her left shoulder in a particular manner. This gesture, she said, had been shown to her in a photograph she studied for several nights before her departure. The photograph showed a conductor in Philadelphia whom she would need to recognize upon arrival. The system worked flawlessly. She was met and conducted to safety. Chen's pulse quickened. A gesture learned from a photograph. A recognition code taught through visual documentation. She kept reading. 3 more entries mentioned similar systems. A man who'd memorized the face of a contact from a daguerreotype. A woman who'd been taught a specific way of folding her hands that would identify her to Underground Railroad operatives. The entries didn't mention Wheelwright by name, but they confirmed the system existed. Chen photographed the relevant pages with her phone, careful not to violate the archive's policies. Then she returned to her apartment and spread everything across her dining room table. The glass negative, the inventory list, Still's journal entries, the letter in the Pennsylvania Freeman. She was looking at pieces of a puzzle, but she couldn't see the complete image yet. The number 47 suggested an organized system. But 47 what? 47 people enrolled in the network? 47 photographs in a hidden collection? 47 safe houses or contacts? Chen needed to find Josiah Wheelwright's records. If he'd kept a ledger matching numbers to names, if any of his documentation had survived, it would be in Charleston. Either in a historical society archive, a family collection, or buried in some storage unit like the one where she'd found the glass plates. She booked a flight to South Carolina for the following week. Before she left, she did one more search through online databases, looking for anything connected to Wheelwright's death in 1859. What she found was a brief article in the Charleston Courier from April 3, 1859. The newspaper reported that photographer Josiah Wheelwright had been discovered dead in his rented rooms on King Street. The cause of death was listed as apoplexy, the 19th century catch-all for strokes, heart attacks, or any sudden death that didn't involve visible violence. The article noted that Wheelwright had no known family in Charleston and that his photographic equipment would be sold at auction to settle debts. But the final paragraph mentioned something that made Chen read the article 3 more times. Mr. Wheelwright's landlord reported finding the studio in disarray, with numerous glass plates broken and papers burned in the fireplace. Whether this destruction occurred before or after the photographer's collapse remains unclear. Authorities have declined to investigate further. Broken glass plates, burned papers. Someone had destroyed Wheelwright's records, either the photographer himself in his final hours, or someone else who'd wanted to eliminate evidence. The system had been designed to be invisible, and when Wheelwright died, someone made sure it stayed that way. The South Carolina Historical Society occupied a Greek Revival building on Meeting Street in Charleston, its white columns and wide porches designed to project permanence and authority. Dr. Chen climbed the front steps on a humid Tuesday morning in late April, carrying her laptop and a folder of documentation she hoped would convince the archivists she was pursuing legitimate research rather than family mythology or lost cause romanticism. The reading room smelled of climate control and old leather. 2 other researchers sat at wooden tables, wearing the white cotton gloves required for handling fragile materials. Chen signed in, presented her university credentials, and requested everything the archive held related to Josiah Wheelwright. The archivist, a woman named Margaret Finch, who'd worked at the Society for 37 years, disappeared into the stacks and returned with a single slim folder. "This is all we have," Finch said. "Wheelwright wasn't prominent enough to warrant a dedicated collection. What's here are fragments from other collections where he's mentioned in passing." Chen opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of business licenses, a few receipts for photographic supplies purchased from a Charleston merchant, and 3 letters. The first letter was from Wheelwright to a photographic supply company in New York, dated March 1853. He was ordering chemicals and glass plates, complaining about the difficulty of obtaining quality materials in Charleston. The tone was professional, focused on technical concerns about emulsion preparation and exposure times. The second letter, dated November 1854, was more interesting. It was addressed to someone named Samuel Harrison in Philadelphia, and it began, "The project you inquired about proceeds slowly but with promising results. I have documented 17 subjects thus far, each using the signaling method we discussed. The glass plates are stored separately from my commercial work, labeled only with numerical indices. Should you require copies, I can produce them upon receipt of your coded confirmation." Chen read the letter twice. 17 subjects, numerical indices, coded confirmation. This was the ledger she'd been looking for, or at least proof it had existed. The third letter was dated February 18th, 59, 2 months before Wheelwright's death. It was written to the same Samuel Harrison, and its tone was markedly different. "I must suspend all operations immediately. The Vigilance Committee has become active again, searching the rooms of suspected abolitionists and questioning merchants who sell to northern transplants. My landlord has made inquiries about the nature of my work, and I fear my sympathies are no longer as concealed as I believed. I have made arrangements to destroy the most sensitive materials should circumstances require it. I urge you to do the same with any correspondence bearing my name. The work was noble, but the risk has become untenable. Chen photographed all 3 letters with her phone, careful to avoid the archivist's sightline. Then she closed the folder and sat back, thinking. Wheelwright had documented at least 17 people using the hand gesture system by November 1854. The photograph of Delilah, Patience, and Grace was numbered 47, which meant the system had expanded significantly in the months that followed. Either Wheelwright had photographed dozens more people, or other photographers had joined the network, or the numbering system included safe houses and contacts, as well as fugitives. And he'd destroyed the evidence before he died. The broken glass plates and burned papers mentioned in the newspaper. Wheelwright had known his death was coming, or at least had feared exposure enough to eliminate the documentary trail. But he'd missed the backup plates, the rejects or duplicates that somehow ended up in storage instead of being destroyed. The glass negative Chen had found was a ghost record, a fragment of a system that was supposed to have vanished completely. She asked Margaret Finch if the archive held any materials related to Samuel Harrison. Finch returned to her computer and searched the database. "No Harrison in our collections," she said. "But that's not surprising if he was based in Philadelphia. You might try the Library Company or the Historical Society of Pennsylvania." Chen thanked her and left the building, stepping out into Charleston's late morning heat. The city streets were crowded with tourists photographing antebellum houses and taking carriage tours narrated by guides who described the grace and elegance of plantation society without mentioning the enslaved workers who built and maintained that world. She walked down Meeting Street toward the waterfront, thinking about Wheelwright's final letter. The Vigilance Committee. In the 1850s, as tensions over slavery intensified and South Carolina moved toward secession, white residents of Charleston had formed committees to police the boundaries of acceptable thought and behavior. They opened mail, searched homes, questioned anyone suspected of abolitionist sympathies. They tarred and feathered a bookstore owner who sold Uncle Tom's Cabin. They forced a visiting minister to leave the city after he refused to affirm that slavery was biblically sanctioned. In that environment, a northern photographer documenting enslaved people who wanted to escape would have been taking enormous risks. Discovery would have meant mob violence at minimum, possibly hanging. Wheelwright had lasted 7 years before fear or exposure forced him to destroy his life's work. Chen needed to find out what had happened to the 3 women in the photograph. Had they escaped? Had they been caught? Had they helped others before running themselves? Or had they stayed on Ravenswood Plantation until the Civil War brought emancipation? She took a taxi to the Charleston County Public Library and requested access to their genealogy and local history collections. The library held digitized copies of 19th century newspapers, tax records, and some plantation documents that hadn't been transferred to state archives. She spent the afternoon searching for references to Delilah, Patience, and Grace. Enslaved people rarely appeared in newspapers unless they'd been arrested, sold, or had run away. Chen combed through runaway advertisements from 1854 through 1860, looking for descriptions that might match the 3 women. Nothing. She tried a different approach, searching for references to Thaddeus Marchand and Ravenswood Plantation. The Charleston Mercury mentioned him occasionally in business announcements and society notices. He'd been a member of the St. Philip's Episcopal Church vestry. He'd served on a committee raising funds for a new hospital. He'd hosted a dinner for visiting legislators during the 1857 social season. The plantation itself appeared in tax records documenting rice production and enslaved labor. The number of workers increased steadily through the 1850s, 43 in 1850, 51 in 1860, 58 in 1861, before the war disrupted record-keeping. Chen found one document that made her stop and read carefully. A property transfer dated March 1855. Thaddeus Marchand had sold 3 enslaved women, described only as household servants, skilled in sewing and domestic work, to a buyer in North Carolina for the sum of $2,100. 3 women, sold together. In March 1855, 9 months after the photograph. The document didn't list their names. Sales records often omitted that detail, referring to enslaved people only by age and skill set. But the timing fit. The number fit. And the price, $700 per woman, suggested young, healthy workers with valuable skills. Were these Delilah, Patience, and Grace? Had they been sold away from Ravenswood, sent to North Carolina where they might have had better opportunities to escape? Or had Marchand discovered their involvement with Wheelwright and punished them by breaking up whatever community they'd formed on his plantation? Chen photographed the transfer document and added it to her growing collection of evidence. Then she searched North Carolina records, looking for property transfers or sale documents that might correspond to the March 1855 date. What she found was a dead end. Thousands of enslaved people were bought and sold in North Carolina during that period. Without names or more specific details about the buyer, she couldn't track the 3 women any further. She closed her laptop and sat in the library's reading room, watching afternoon light slant through tall windows. Outside, Charleston went about its business, a city built on wealth extracted from rice fields and cotton plantations, now transformed into a tourist destination where people paid to tour the same houses where enslaved workers had lived and died. The photograph of Delilah, Patience, and Grace had survived 165 years. Their faces were preserved, their coded hand gesture immortalized on glass. But their voices were silent, their fates unknown. Chen couldn't bring them back. She couldn't make the archive speak where it had chosen to be mute. But she could keep searching, keep assembling fragments, keep honoring the risk they'd taken when they sat for Josiah Wheelwright's camera and let him document their defiance in a way that only other conspirators would understand. Chen returned to Durham and spent 3 weeks corresponding with archivists across the Northeast, searching for any reference to Samuel Harrison or the photographic identification system Wheelwright had described in his letters. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania had nothing under that name. Neither did the Library Company of Philadelphia or the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. She expanded her search, looking for mentions of coded photography or visual recognition systems in abolitionist correspondence from the 1850s. What she found was scattered but suggestive. A letter from Frederick Douglass to an unnamed correspondent, dated September 1855. The method you describe of teaching contacts to recognize one another through studied images is ingenious and relatively safe, provided the images themselves do not fall into hostile hands. I would recommend destroying such portraits after they have served their purpose. An entry in the journal of Levi Coffin, the Quaker who ran one of the most active underground railroad networks in the Midwest. We received a visitor who identified himself through a gesture he had learned from a photographic image. This system, though new to me, seems effective. The difficulty lies in creating and distributing the images without arousing suspicion. A report from the American Anti-Slavery Society, published in 1856, mentioned new methods of coordination between operatives in slave states and reception committees in free territory, including the use of visual documentation for identification purposes. The system was real. It had operated across multiple states, and someone somewhere might still have the ledger that indexed the photographs. Chen shifted her research to burial records and death certificates, trying to find out what had happened to Samuel Harrison. If he'd been based in Philadelphia, if he'd survived the Civil War, he might have left papers or correspondence that mentioned Wheelwright. She found 3 Samuel Harrisons who'd lived in Philadelphia during the 1850s. One was a clerk who died in 1858 of typhoid fever. One was a merchant who'd moved to California in 1860. The third was a printer who'd been active in the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and who'd lived until 1897. Chen requested access to the printer's papers from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The collection arrived via interlibrary loan 6 weeks later. 3 archival boxes containing business correspondence, family letters, and newspaper clippings. She spent 2 days going through everything, looking for any mention of Wheelwright or the photographic project. Most of the papers dealt with Harrison's printing business, contracts for pamphlet production, invoices for ink and paper, advertisements for his services. But buried in the 3rd box, Chen found a leather-bound journal Harrison had kept during the 1850s. The entries were brief, often cryptic. Harrison wrote in a kind of shorthand, using abbreviations and code words that made many passages difficult to interpret. But on June 23, 1854, he'd written, "Received first batch from J.W. 17 plates, excellent quality. Distributed copies to stations per standing protocols. System shows promise." June 23rd. 5 days after the photograph of Delilah, Patience, and Grace. Chen kept reading. Over the following months, Harrison's journal documented the expansion of what he called the Identification Project. By December 1854, he'd received 41 plates from Charleston. By March 1855, the number had increased to 63. Each batch was copied and distributed to Underground Railroad contacts who needed to recognize specific fugitives or identify themselves as safe conductors. Then, in April 1859, Harrison wrote, "Devastating news from Charleston. J.W. is dead, circumstances suspicious. All materials must be destroyed immediately. Sent urgent warnings to remaining contacts. The project is compromised." The next entry, dated May 1859, was even more ominous. "Burned all plates and copies in the print shop furnace. Kept only this journal, which I will encode more carefully. 3 operatives in Charleston have gone silent. Fear the worst." Chen photographed the relevant journal pages and returned the boxes to the interlibrary loan office. Then she sat in her apartment, trying to reconstruct what had happened. Wheelwright had photographed at least 63 people between June 1854 and his death in April 1859. Those images had been copied and distributed to Underground Railroad stations throughout the North, allowing fugitives and conductors to identify one another without verbal descriptions that could be intercepted or misunderstood. But in 1859, something had gone wrong. Wheelwright was dead, his studio was destroyed, and Samuel Harrison, fearing exposure, had burned every plate and copy in his possession, except that some images had survived. The glass plates Chen had found in the storage unit. Either Wheelwright had hidden backup copies that weren't destroyed, or someone else in the network had kept documentation despite Harrison's orders. Chen needed to find out who that someone was. She returned to the auction records, tracing the provenance of Harold Vickers's estate. He'd purchased the photographic plates in 1978 from an estate sale in Charleston. Chen contacted the auction house that had handled Vickers's estate and asked if they had documentation about the 1978 purchase. The auction company sent her a scanned copy of the original bill of sale. The plates had been part of a larger lot described as photographic equipment and miscellaneous glass negatives sold from the estate of Martha Wheelwright Clemson, deceased at age 94. Martha Wheelwright Clemson. The name sent Chen scrambling back to her research files. She found a reference in a genealogy database. Martha Wheelwright had been born in Charleston in 1836, the daughter of a merchant. She'd married James Clemson in 1856, and according to census records, her brother had been Josiah Wheelwright, the photographer. Josiah had a sister who'd apparently kept some of his glass plates after his death, hidden them for more than a century, and taken them to her grave. Chen pulled up Martha Clemson's death certificate. She died in Charleston on January 14, 1978, survived by no children. Her estate had been liquidated at auction, and everything she'd owned, furniture, clothing, books, and a box of old photographic plates, had been sold to settle final expenses. The plates had been labeled Old Pictures, Fragile. No one at the auction had examined them closely. They'd been purchased as a lot by Vickers, a collector who'd probably seen them as Civil War memorabilia without understanding what they actually documented. And for 41 years, they'd sat in a storage unit, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the hands. If Martha Wheelwright had protected her brother's work for decades, Chen reasoned, she must have known what the photographs meant. She must have understood the risk he'd taken and believed the documentation was worth preserving even after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. Chen began researching Martha's life, looking for evidence of abolitionist sympathies or Underground Railroad connections. Church records seemed like a good starting point. In Charleston's stratified society, religious affiliation revealed a lot about a person's politics and social position. The South Carolina Historical Society's genealogy files listed Martha as a member of the Unitarian Church of Charleston. That detail was significant. The Unitarian congregation was small, never numbering more than 60 families, and it was one of the few churches in the city where anti-slavery sentiment could be expressed cautiously. Chen requested the church's historical records from the Charleston County Library. What arrived was a microfilm reel containing membership rolls, vestry minutes, and baptismal records from 1835 through 1920. She loaded the reel into the library's microfilm reader and began scanning through the entries. Martha Wheelwright appeared in the records in 1847 at age 11 when she was baptized. Her brother Josiah was listed as a sponsor, along with another man named Daniel Fortin. Chen wrote down the name and kept reading. The church minutes documented business matters, roof repairs, disputes over theology, fundraising for missionary work. But in November 1854, the vestry had recorded a terse note. Voted to accept resignation of Daniel Fortin from vestry effective immediately. No reasons stated. Forced resignations were usually recorded that way when the actual reasons were too controversial to document. Chen searched for other references to Fortin. He appeared in member lists through 1857, then vanished from the records entirely. She switched to newspaper archives, looking for Daniel Fortin in Charleston city directories and business announcements. She found him listed as a grain merchant with an office on East Bay Street. He imported rice and corn from inland plantations and arranged shipment to northern markets. A grain merchant. Someone who had legitimate business reasons to travel regularly between Charleston and northern cities. Someone who could transport more than just agricultural products without arousing suspicion. Chen found a brief news item from the Charleston Courier. dated August 18, 57. Daniel Fortin, grain merchant, departed this city for parts unknown. Business associates report he left no forwarding address and settled his accounts before departing. His sudden departure has occasioned much speculation. Parts unknown was newspaper code for someone who'd left under questionable circumstances. And the timing, 1857, 2 years before Wheelwright's death, suggested that Fortin had fled before the Vigilance Committee caught up with him. Chen made a note to search for Daniel Fortin in Northern records. If he'd escaped Charleston and continued working with the Underground Railroad, he might have left documentation. She returned to the church microfilm, scanning through baptismal records and marriage certificates. In June 1856, Martha Wheelwright had married James Clemson, a cotton factor who managed the sale of plantation crops. The wedding was performed by the Unitarian minister, and Daniel Fortin was listed among the witnesses. 6 months before Fortin disappeared. Chen kept reading, and in the church records from 1858, she found something that made her stop the microfilm and rewind to read it again. A notation in the vestry minutes from March. Motion to establish Ladies' Benevolent Society for provision of clothing and supplies to persons in distress. Founding members: Martha Clemson, Sarah Bonneau, Elizabeth Grimball. A benevolent society. Officially, these organizations made clothing for the poor and collected donations for missionary work. But they also provided cover for more covert activities. Women gathered to sew and could produce items, trousers, coats, documents hidden in coat linings, that fugitive slaves would need for escape attempts. Chen cross-referenced the names. Sarah Bonneau and Elizabeth Grimball both appeared in church records from the 1850s. Both women's husbands were merchants with business connections to northern cities. Both families left Charleston in the early 1860s, before the worst of the war. She was looking at a network. Wheelwright photographing people using coded gestures. Fortin transporting the images north. Harrison distributing copies to Underground Railroad contacts. And Martha and her benevolent society producing the clothing and documents fugitives would need when they ran. The system had been more sophisticated than Chen had imagined. It wasn't just one photographer working alone. It was a coordinated operation involving at least a dozen people in Charleston and probably many more in northern cities. And when the network was compromised in 1859, most of the participants had fled or destroyed evidence. But Martha had kept her brother's backup plates, hidden them for 63 years, and refused to destroy documentation that might someday tell the truth about what had happened in Charleston before the war. Chen photographed the relevant church records and returned to her apartment. She made coffee and spread her notes across the dining room table, trying to map the network's structure. Wheelwright, photographer, documentation specialist. Fortin, courier, transporting plates to northern contacts. Harrison, distributor, making copies and sending them to Underground Railroad stations. Martha and the Yakika Benevolent Society, producing supplies and possibly forging freedom papers. And somewhere in this network, 3 young women named Delilah, Patience, and Grace had taken their seats in Wheelwright's studio and let him photograph their defiance. Chen's next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. She was presenting her research at a graduate student conference in Atlanta when a woman in the audience approached her during the coffee break. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Keisha Washington, a genealogist who specialized in tracing African American family histories through the antebellum period. "I think I've seen that hand gesture before," Washington said. She pulled out her phone and showed Chen a photograph she'd discovered in a family collection 6 months earlier. The image was a tintype from the 1860s, showing an elderly black woman seated in a chair. Her hands were folded on her lap in the same precise configuration, thumb and forefinger forming a circle, 3 fingers splayed at specific angles. "This is my great-great-great-grandmother," Washington explained. Her name was Delilah Freeman. She lived in Philadelphia after the Civil War and worked as a seamstress. Family stories said she'd escaped from South Carolina in the 1850s, but I've never been able to find documentation of how she got north. Chen felt her pulse accelerate. Did the family stories mention where in South Carolina? Charleston area, maybe a rice plantation outside the city. The details got fuzzy over generations. Chen pulled up the image of the 3 women from Wheelwright's studio on her laptop. "Is this her?" Washington leaned in to look at the screen. She studied the photograph for a long moment, comparing it to the tintype on her phone. "It could be," she said slowly. "The ages would be right. If this was taken in 1854 and she was about 19, she'd be in her 70s or 80s in my photograph. The facial structure looks similar." Chen explained her research. The glass plates, the numbered system, the network of photographers and conductors. Washington listened with increasing excitement. "If this is her," Washington said, "if Delilah Freeman was one of your 3 women, I can tell you what happened after she escaped. She arrived in Philadelphia sometime in 1855. She worked as a seamstress and married a man named Robert Freeman in 1862. They had 4 children. She was active in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and helped raise money for freedmen's schools after the war. She died in 1893 at age 58. Did she ever talk about her escape? Did she leave any written account?" Washington shook her head. "Not that survived in the family, but there's a story my grandmother told me. She said Delilah kept a box of old photographs hidden in her closet, and she told her children those pictures had saved her life. She wouldn't explain what she meant, just said that faces in photographs could be trusted when words couldn't." Chen felt a chill despite the warm conference room. "Do you know what happened to those photographs?" "Lost in a house fire in 1908. Most of the family's possessions were destroyed." Another dead end, but also confirmation. If Delilah Freeman had kept photographs hidden for decades after her escape, photographs she claimed had saved her life, it supported Chen's theory about the identification network. "What about the other 2 women in the studio portrait?" Washington asked. "Have you found any trace of them?" "Not yet. I know 3 enslaved women were sold from Ravenswood Plantation in March 1855. If that was your great-great-great-grandmother and her companions, they might have been sold to facilitate an escape. It was easier to run from a new location where overseers didn't know you well and where plantation routines weren't yet familiar." Washington considered this. "My family story says Delilah was helped by a network of people she recognized from pictures. She was told to look for specific faces and specific gestures. When she reached Philadelphia, she was met by a white woman who made this same hand signal." Washington demonstrated the thumb and forefinger circle, and Delilah knew she was safe. The system had worked, at least for Delilah. She'd studied photographs, memorized faces and gestures, and used that knowledge to navigate from South Carolina to Pennsylvania. She'd survived long enough to build a new life, to marry and have children, to become someone other than the property listed in Thaddeus Marchand's ledgers. But what about Patience and Grace? Had they made it north as well? Or had they been caught, sold, punished for their involvement with Wheelwright's network? Chen and Washington exchanged contact information and promised to share any new discoveries. Then Chen returned to Durham with renewed determination. she'd found one of the three women. The photograph had a name now, a story that extended beyond the glass plate and into a life lived in freedom. 2 more women to find, dozens more photographs to decode, a network to map across states and decades. Chen began searching Philadelphia city directories from 1855 through 1860, looking for seamstresses who might have been newly arrived fugitives. The directories listed hundreds of women in the sewing trades, most identified only by name and street address. Without more specific information, she couldn't identify Patience or Grace. She tried a different approach, searching for references to escaped slaves from South Carolina in Philadelphia newspaper accounts from that period. The city's abolitionist press occasionally reported arrivals of fugitives, though they were careful not to provide details that might help slave catchers. In the Pennsylvania Freeman from April 1855, Chen found a brief notice. 3 travelers from the South arrived safely at our city's stations this week, having completed their journey with assistance from friends along the way. They have been provided with employment and shelter. We rejoice in their deliverance. 3 travelers arrived in April 1855, 1 month after the sale from Ravenswood Plantation. The timing fit perfectly. Chen knew her research was missing a crucial element. She documented the network of people who'd helped enslaved workers escape. She'd found evidence of the photographic identification system. She'd traced one woman's journey from Charleston to Philadelphia, but she hadn't addressed the other side of the story. The white Charlestonians who'd known what was happening and had chosen to look away, to collaborate, or to actively hunt down anyone suspected of abolitionist sympathies. She returned to Charleston in June and spent a week in the city archives, reading through Vigilance Committee records and newspaper accounts of suspected abolitionists being questioned or expelled from the city. What she found was a catalog of casual cruelty and willful blindness, neighbors informing on neighbors, church members reporting fellow congregants, business partners turning on each other the moment suspicion arose. In August 1856, a white woman named Helen Garrett had been forced to leave Charleston after she was overheard saying that slavery was morally wrong. The Vigilance Committee searched her home and found abolitionist literature hidden in her bedroom. She was escorted to the train station and warned never to return. Her husband, a lawyer who'd lived in Charleston for 20 years, divorced her rather than defend her views. In November 1857, a Northern teacher at a private girls' school was questioned after one of her students reported that she'd spoken favorably about Harriet Beecher Stowe. The teacher denied the accusation, but she was dismissed from her position and left the city within days. The Vigilance Committee kept records of people they suspected. Chen found a ledger documenting persons of interest from 1856 through 1860. Josiah Wheelwright's name appeared on a list dated March 1859, 1 month before his death. Beside his name, someone had written, "Northern Transplant, associates with questionable elements, studio to be monitored." Daniel Fortin appeared on the same list, with the notation, "Grain merchant, travels frequently to Philadelphia, correspondence to be intercepted." Martha Wheelwright Clemson did not appear. If she'd been involved in her brother's network, she'd been careful enough or quiet enough to avoid suspicion. Or perhaps being a woman had protected her. The Vigilance Committee focused primarily on men, assuming women were too docile or too limited in their movements to pose real threats. Chen also found records of enslaved people who'd attempted to escape and been caught. The punishments documented in plantation ledgers and newspaper accounts made her stomach turn. Whippings, brandings, sale to the Deep South where conditions were even worse. One man who'd been caught near the North Carolina border was brought back to Charleston and hanged in public as a warning. The message was clear. Resistance would be crushed. Escape attempts would be punished with maximum severity, and anyone who helped enslaved workers flee would face mob violence. In that environment, what Wheelwright and his network had attempted was extraordinarily dangerous. Every photograph was evidence. Every hand gesture was a confession. Every person who knew about the system was a potential informant if caught and tortured. Chen sat in the reading room thinking about something her advisor, Dr. Cole, had said. Documentary proof would complicate comfortable lies. The comfortable lie White Charleston had told itself was that enslaved people were content, that the system was benevolent, that resistance was rare and always the work of outside agitators. The truth was that people had been plotting escape constantly, building networks, communicating through coded gestures and hidden signals, risking everything for the chance to be free. And their white neighbors had known. Some had helped, some had informed. Most had simply looked away, maintaining plausible deniability while enslaved workers vanished in the night or returned in chains. What would you do, Chen wondered, if you lived in a city where speaking against slavery could get you expelled or killed? Would you risk everything to help strangers escape? Would you keep quiet and try to survive? Would you join the Vigilance Committee and protect the system? She didn't know. She wanted to believe she'd be brave, but courage looked different when your life and family were at stake. The people who'd helped Wheelwright's network had made extraordinary choices. So had the people who'd betrayed it. Chen packed up her notes and left the archive. Outside, tourists crowded the historic district, taking pictures of beautiful houses built with wealth extracted from enslaved labor. Tour guides told stories about gracious living and Southern hospitality. No one mentioned the Vigilance Committee. No one talked about the people who'd been hunted through these streets for daring to imagine freedom. History, Chen thought, is what gets remembered. The comfortable version, the one that doesn't disturb tourism or property values. Everything else becomes footnotes, or it disappears entirely. But sometimes a photograph survives. Sometimes someone keeps a box of glass plates hidden for 63 years. Sometimes the truth waits patiently for someone to look closely enough to see what was always there in the hands. Chen returned to Durham with a new theory. The number 47 etched into the glass plate wasn't just an index number. It was a code that connected to something specific, something that would help identify what the three women's role had been within the network. She went back to Samuel Harrison's journal, reading more carefully through his cryptic entries. In July 1854, he'd written, "Received organizational schema from JW, categories established, conductors marked 120, safe houses 2140, operatives in hostile territory 4160, fugitives in transit 61 plus. Operatives in hostile territory, numbers 41 through 60. Delilah, Patience, and Grace weren't fugitives who'd already escaped. They were active participants in the network while still enslaved, working from inside Ravenswood Plantation to help others escape. That changed everything Chen thought she knew about the photograph. She pulled up the image again and studied it with this new understanding. The women weren't posing as documentation of their own planned escape. They were being enrolled in the network as trusted contacts who could be recognized by fugitives passing through the Charleston area. The seamstress skills listed on Marchand's inventory suddenly made more sense. Delilah, Patience, and Grace had been making clothing for escapees. They'd been sewing hidden pockets into coats, preparing disguises, possibly forging freedom papers that could pass cursory inspection. and they'd been willing to be photographed, to have their faces distributed to Underground Railroad contacts throughout the North, because the work was more important than their personal safety. Chen searched through William Still's journal again, looking for references to people who'd escaped from Charleston with help from contacts inside the slave system. She found multiple entries describing fugitives who'd arrived in Philadelphia with forged papers and traveling clothes that had been provided by friends in the South. One entry from September 1854 described a man who'd escaped from a plantation near Charleston. He reported being given a complete set of traveling clothes and a freedom paper by 3 women who worked at a nearby estate. These women risked severe punishment to assist him, asking only that he remember their faces if he ever encountered them in the North. He described them as young seamstresses who met with him by arrangement after dark. 3 women, seamstresses, near Charleston. Chen photographed the journal entry and added it to her research file. Then she began searching for more references to enslaved people who'd worked as operatives rather than fugitives. The historical record was sparse. People who'd remained in the South while helping others escape had been at constant risk of discovery. And after the war, many had simply disappeared into new lives without documenting what they'd done. But Chen found fragments. A letter from an abolitionist in Boston, dated October 1855, mentioned brave souls who remain in bondage by choice, sacrificing their own freedom to facilitate the escapes of others. A memoir published in 1892 by a former slave described a network of house servants and skilled workers who used their limited mobility to pass information and supplies between plantations. Delilah, Patience, and Grace had been part of that network. They'd stayed at Ravenswood Plantation, used their access to the main house and their sewing skills to prepare escapees, and risked everything knowing they might never benefit personally from the system they were helping to build. Until March 1855, when they were sold to North Carolina. Chen wondered if that sale had been punishment or opportunity. Had Thaddeus Marchand discovered their involvement and sold them to break up the network? Or had the sale been arranged deliberately, moving them to a location where escape would be easier? She searched North Carolina records again, this time focusing on sales to buyers in areas close to Underground Railroad routes. The state had several active networks running through its western counties, where rugged terrain and Quaker settlements provided cover for fugitives heading north. In April 1855, a property transfer in Guilford County documented the purchase of 3 female servants skilled in domestic work by a farmer named Isaac Wilson. The price was $2,100, matching the amount Marchand had received. Chen pulled up census records for Isaac Wilson. He was listed as a Quaker farmer, age 57, with a wife and 2 adult sons. His farm was located 6 miles from the town of Greensboro, in an area known to be sympathetic to anti-slavery causes, despite North Carolina's slaveholding status. She found Wilson's name in the records of the Guilford County Friends meeting. He'd been a member in good standing since 1842. His farm had been searched twice by local authorities in the 1850s on suspicion of harboring fugitive slaves, but no evidence had been found. Because Wilson was good at hiding people. Because his farm was a station on the Underground Railroad. Because 3 women with network training and photographic documentation would have been invaluable assets at a safe house. Chen found confirmation in a letter archived at the Friends Historical Library in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. The letter, dated June 1855, was from Isaac Wilson to a Quaker contact in Philadelphia. It read, "The 3 friends who arrived in spring are proving most helpful. Their skills in sewing and their knowledge of procedures from their previous location have allowed us to assist many more travelers. We are grateful for their presence. 3 friends. Arrived in spring. Skills in sewing and knowledge of procedures. Delilah, Patience, and Grace had been transferred from one network position to another. The sale from Ravenswood hadn't been punishment. It had been extraction, moving them to a safer location where they could continue their work without the constant surveillance of Charleston's Vigilance Committee. And sometime between April and September 1855, Delilah had made the final journey north to Philadelphia, where she'd started a new life as Delilah Freeman. But what about Patience and Grace? Had they escaped as well? Or had they remained at Wilson's farm, continuing to help others until the Civil War made such networks obsolete? Chen contacted the Friends' Historical Library and requested access to Isaac Wilson's papers. What arrived 3 weeks later was a treasure. 2 boxes containing farm records, correspondence, and a journal Wilson had kept from 1853 through 1865. She spent an entire weekend reading through the journal, learning about Wilson's work with the Underground Railroad. He documented coded language, travelers for fugitives, parcels for supplies, shipments for escape attempts. He was careful never to use real names or explicit descriptions that could be used as evidence if the journal was discovered. But in August 1855, he wrote, "One of our 3 friends departed for Northern connections this week. She carried instructions and recognition materials. The other 2 remain to assist with ongoing operations. Their contribution has been invaluable. 1 departed, 2 remained. Delilah had left for Philadelphia. Patience and Grace had stayed in North Carolina." Chen kept reading. Wilson's journal documented a dramatic increase in successful escapes after April 1855. In the previous year, he'd helped maybe a dozen people reach the North. In the 18 months after the 3 women arrived, that number jumped to 37. In December 1856, Wilson wrote, "P&G continue their excellent work. They have trained 2 others in their methods. The network grows stronger. P&G, Patience, and Grace, training new operatives, expanding the system." Then, in April 1857, disaster. Authorities searched the property today, acting on information from an unknown source. Found nothing, as we had warning enough to relocate materials. But the scrutiny has increased. Must consider whether our friends should be moved to safer locations. May 1857. Decision made. P will relocate north. G insists on remaining to complete current commitments. I honor her courage but fear for her safety. Patience had left for the north. Grace had stayed. Chen searched through the remaining journal entries, looking for references to Grace. She found mentions of G continues her work, and G assisted 4 travelers this month, but no indication of when or whether Grace had eventually escaped. The journal ended abruptly in March 1865, just as the Civil War was concluding. Wilson's final entry read, "Freedom has come through war rather than individual flight. Our work here is finished. Those who remained in bondage to help others can now walk free by law rather than by night. I pray they find peace in this new world they helped create." Chen set down the journal and stared at her apartment wall. Grace had stayed. Through 1857, 1858, 1859, through the war years, helping others escape while remaining enslaved herself. Whether by choice or circumstance, Grace had sacrificed her own freedom to facilitate the escapes of dozens of others. She'd been photographed in Wheelwright's studio in 1854, enrolled as operative number 47 in a network that spanned states and involved dozens of conspirators. She'd worked at Ravenswood Plantation, been sold to Isaac Wilson's farm, and continued her work under different conditions, but with the same purpose. Chen needed to find out what had happened to Grace after the war. Had she survived? Had she built a life in freedom? Or had she disappeared into the chaos of Reconstruction without leaving a trace? She searched North Carolina records for African Americans with the first name Grace living in Guilford County after 1865. The Freedmen's Bureau records listed dozens of women with that name, most without surnames or with surnames they'd chosen themselves after emancipation. One entry caught Chen's attention. A Grace Wilson, age 31, listed as living on a farm outside Greensboro in the 1870 census. Her occupation was listed as seamstress. She lived in the household of Isaac Wilson, now age 72, and his wife Martha, age 69. Grace had taken Wilson's surname. She'd stayed on the farm, not as an enslaved worker, but as a free woman who'd chosen to remain with people she trusted. Chen found her in the 1880 census as well. Grace Wilson, age 41, still in Guilford County, still working as a seamstress. She lived alone by then. Isaac and Martha Wilson had both died in the 1870s, in a small house on land that had once been part of the Wilson farm. The trail ended there. Chen couldn't find Grace in the 1890 census or any death records from that decade. Either the records had been lost, or Grace had moved to a different location, or she died somewhere between 1880 and 1890 without official documentation. But she'd lived. She'd survived. And she'd taken the surname of the Quaker farmer who'd given her shelter and respected her choice to remain part of the network, even when escape would have been possible. 3 women photographed in Charleston in 1854. Delilah escaped to Philadelphia and lived until 1893. Patience escaped sometime before 1860 and disappeared into the historical record. Grace stayed until freedom came through war, then lived quietly in North Carolina for at least 2 more decades. Chen had found them. Not every detail, not every day of their lives, but enough to know they'd been real. They'd taken enormous risks, and they'd helped dozens of other people escape from slavery before securing their own freedom. The photograph was no longer anonymous. The faces had names. The hands had meaning. Chen's research hit a wall. She'd traced the 3 women in the photograph. She'd documented the network they'd worked within. She'd proven the photographic identification system had existed. But she still hadn't found the master ledger, the indexed record of all 63 people Wheelwright had photographed before his death. She'd been searching for 2 years. Her dissertation was overdue. Dr. Cole was pressuring her to finish writing with the evidence she had. But Chen couldn't let go of the idea that the ledger existed somewhere, hidden the way Martha Wheelwright had hidden the glass plates. In March 2021, she received an email from a researcher at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The society was processing a newly donated collection of papers from a Boston family, and they'd found several documents that mentioned the Underground Railroad and photographic identification systems. Chen drove to Boston the next day. The collection had belonged to the family of Thomas Garrett, a Quaker who'd worked with the Underground Railroad in Wilmington, Delaware. Garrett had helped more than 2,700 enslaved people escape to freedom, and he'd kept detailed records despite the legal risks. Among his papers, the Massachusetts Historical Society had found a leather-bound notebook, water-damaged and partially illegible. Inside were lists of names, numbers, and brief descriptions. The archivist had flagged it as potentially significant, but hadn't yet analyzed its contents fully. Chen requested access to the notebook and spent the entire day photographing its pages and transcribing what she could read. The notebook was organized numerically, with entries ranging from number 1 through number 68. Each entry contained a name, a physical description, a location, and a category designation. C for conductor, S for safe house, O for operative, F for fugitive. Entry number 47 read, 3 operatives, Charleston area, names, Delilah, Patience, Grace, ages, 18-19, skills, sewing, literacy, document preparation. Contact method, hand signal, thumb forefinger circle, 3 fingers extended. Photographed June 1854. Status as of March 1855. Relocated to North Carolina Station. Chen's hands shook as she photographed the page. This was it. The ledger. The master record of everyone enrolled in Wheelwright's network. She kept reading. The notebook documented 68 people total, 20 conductors, most based in northern cities, 19 safe houses scattered from Maryland to Massachusetts, 24 operatives who remained in slave states, working from within the system, 5 fugitives who'd been photographed after escaping, their images distributed to help them recognize friendly contacts. The categories didn't quite match what Harrison had written in his journal, which suggested the system had evolved over time or that different network branches used different numbering schemes. But the core concept was clear. Visual documentation as a security measure, allowing people to recognize one another without verbal descriptions that could be intercepted or misunderstood. Chen found Josiah Wheelwright's entry. Number 12, conductor, Charleston. Operates photographic studio. Creates documentation for network. Northern sympathies known to select colleagues but not publicly acknowledged. Daniel Fortin was number 15. Conductor, Charleston. Grain merchant. Transports materials between South Carolina and Philadelphia. Departed Charleston, August 1857, under pressure from Vigilance Committee. Martha Clemson didn't appear in the ledger at all, which confirmed Chen's suspicion that she'd remained hidden, working in the background, while her brother took the visible risks. The notebook's final entries were dated April 1859, the month Wheelwright died. Someone, probably Thomas Garrett, had written a note at the bottom of the last page. All materials destroyed per emergency protocols. This record kept in secure location for historical documentation should it ever become safe to reveal the truth. Garrett had violated the network's own security procedures. He'd kept the ledger even though Harrison and others had burned their copies, because he believed someone would eventually need to know who these people were, what they'd risked, what they'd accomplished. Chen finished photographing the notebook and thanked the archivist. Then she sat in the research room, thinking about what she'd found. 68 people enrolled in a network that operated for 5 years before being compromised. 3 women whose photograph had survived 167 years. A ledger hidden for more than a century and a half, waiting for someone to decode what it meant. She had her dissertation. She had proof. She had names and faces and a story that needed to be told. But she also understood why Thomas Garrett had been reluctant to make this public even after slavery ended. Because naming names meant creating consequences for descendants. Because some families had spent generations burying the truth about their ancestors. Because documentary proof would complicate comfortable lies. What would she do with this information? Publish it and let the consequences fall where they might? Or follow Martha Wheelwright's example and protect it for another generation, waiting for a time when the truth wouldn't threaten the living? Chen defended her dissertation in May 2021. The committee accepted her research with the caveat that she redact certain identifying information from the published version. She couldn't use the real names of enslaved workers without their descendants' permission. She couldn't publish photographs that might allow people to be identified. She could document the system and prove it existed, but she had to protect the privacy of the dead. The restrictions frustrated her, but she understood the reasoning. History wasn't just about what happened. It was about who controlled the narrative, who had the right to tell certain stories, who could speak for people who'd been silenced. She contacted Dr. Keisha Washington and asked whether Delilah Freeman's descendants would consent to having her story told. Washington consulted with her family and brought the question to a family reunion that summer. The family voted unanimously to allow Delilah's story to be shared. They wanted people to know what their ancestor had done, the risks she'd taken, the people she'd helped. But they also insisted that Chen acknowledge the cost. Delilah had escaped to freedom, but she'd left family behind in the South. She'd lived the rest of her life not knowing whether her parents or siblings had survived. The photograph showed her face, but it couldn't capture the grief of separation or the trauma of being owned. Chen revised her dissertation to include those complexities. She wrote about the network as a system, documenting its structure and methods. But she also wrote about the individual people who'd made it work, the choices they'd faced, the prices they'd paid. Patients remained anonymous in the published version. Chen had found some evidence of her escape to the north, but no confirmed documentation of her later life. Without permission from descendants, she referred to patients only as the second woman in the photograph. Grace's story posed different questions. She'd taken the Wilson surname after emancipation, suggesting she'd built relationships with the Quaker family that sheltered her. But Chen couldn't find any living descendants or family members who could grant permission to tell her story fully. In the end, Chen published Grace's narrative as well, reasoning that the woman had made herself visible by staying, by continuing to work with the Underground Railroad, even when escape was possible. Grace had chosen to be documented. She'd allowed Wheelwright to photograph her face and encode her involvement in a network that spanned states. To hide her now would be to undo the very choice she'd made in 1854. The dissertation was published by Duke University Press in 2022. It was titled Coded Faces, Photographic Networks, and the Underground Railroad in the Antebellum South. Reviews were mixed. Some scholars praised Chen's archival work and her documentation of the visual identification system. Others criticized her decision to name individuals without complete genealogical permission. Chen received hate mail from people who accused her of dishonoring their ancestors by suggesting they'd owned slaves or participated in vigilance committees. She received grateful messages from descendants of Underground Railroad operatives who'd never known their ancestors' stories. And she received one letter that made her cry. It was from a woman named Patricia Harrison, who'd done genealogical research on her family and discovered that her great-great-great-grandfather had been Samuel Harrison, the printer who distributed Wheelwright's photographs to Underground Railroad contacts. I always wondered why my ancestor kept a leather journal locked in a box he carried until the day he died, Patricia wrote. He never told his children what was in it. My grandfather found it after his death and couldn't make sense of the coded entries. Reading your research, I finally understand. He was protecting people. Even after slavery ended, even after it was safe, he never broke confidence. Thank you for honoring that. Chen framed the letter and hung it on her office wall. It reminded her why this work mattered, why finding the truth was worth the years of research and the uncomfortable conversations and the criticism from people who preferred history to stay buried. 3 women in borrowed silk dresses, hands folded in coded gestures, a number etched into glass, a network that helped dozens of people escape from slavery. The photograph had kept its secret for 167 years. Now the story belonged to everyone. Dr. Sarah Chen's book was published in hardcover in March 2023, 4 years after she'd found the glass plate in that Raleigh storage unit. The publication generated more attention than she'd expected. News outlets picked up the story. Museums requested permission to display the photograph of Delilah, Patience, and Grace. Descendants of Underground Railroad participants reached out with their own family stories. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. In April 2023, Chen received an email from an archivist at the Charleston Museum. While processing a recently donated collection, they'd discovered a small metal box hidden in the false bottom of an antique trunk. The trunk had belonged to Martha Wheelwright Clemson and had been stored in an attic for decades before being donated to the museum. Inside the box were 12 glass plate negatives, each showing a different person or group of people. Each plate had a number etched in the corner, ranging from 19 to 53. And each person in the photographs held their hands in deliberate coded positions. More documentation from Wheelwright's network. More faces that had survived when almost everything else was destroyed. Chen flew to Charleston that same week. The museum archivist, a man named David Porter, had laid out the plates on a light table in the conservation lab. Chen examined them one by one, comparing the hand gestures to descriptions in Thomas Garrett's ledger. Plate 19 showed a middle-aged black man in work clothes, his fingers arranged to form a specific pattern. According to Garrett's ledger, number 19 was Operative Virginia Plantation, skills in carpentry and metalwork. Plate 27 showed two young women, possibly sisters, both using the same gesture. The ledger listed them as safe house contacts, Baltimore area, able to provide temporary shelter and supplies. Plate 41 showed a white man in minister's clothing, his hands folded in a different coded position. The ledger identified him as conductor, Methodist circuit rider, travels throughout Maryland and Virginia. Each photograph was a fragment of the network, a piece of the puzzle that Wheelwright and his collaborators had built across state lines and social boundaries. Martha must have kept these separate from the main collection, Porter said. Maybe she knew they were too dangerous to keep with her other possessions. The trunk they were in had multiple false compartments, very sophisticated concealment. Chen photographed the plates and added them to her research archive. Then she asked the question that had been haunting her since finding the first photograph. Why did Martha keep these? Why risk having them found? Why not destroy everything the way the network protocols required? Porter considered this. Maybe she believed documentation was worth the risk. Maybe she thought someday people would need proof that resistance existed, that there were people who fought back even when the law said they were property. Or maybe she just couldn't bring herself to destroy her brother's work. Chen thought about Josiah Wheelwright, dying at age 41 in a rented room above his photography studio. She thought about him burning papers and smashing glass plates, trying to protect the network he'd helped build. She thought about Martha watching her brother die, and then making the decision to hide some of the evidence rather than let it all disappear. History, Chen reflected, was shaped as much by what people chose to preserve as by what actually happened. Martha Wheelwright had shaped history by keeping 12 glass plates and a box of backup negatives when protocol demanded total destruction. Thomas Garrett had shaped history by maintaining his ledger despite the security risks. Delilah, Patience, and Grace had shaped history by agreeing to be photographed in the first place. And now Chen was shaping history by telling their stories, by making public what had been hidden, by giving names and faces to people who'd been deliberately anonymous. "We're planning an exhibition," Porter said. "The photographs, your research, contextual materials about the Underground Railroad in South Carolina. We want to tell the story of this network and the people who risked everything to make it work. Would you be willing to consult on the project? Chen agreed. She spent the next 6 months working with the Charleston Museum to develop an exhibition that would open in February 2024, exactly 170 years after Josiah Wheelwright had photographed Delilah, Patience, and Grace. The exhibition was titled Coded Faces, A Hidden Network Revealed. It featured the original glass plates, enlarged prints of the photographs, copies of the ledger and correspondence, and biographical information about the people who'd been documented. On opening night, Chen stood in the gallery watching visitors examine the photographs. She saw people studying the hand gestures, reading the wall text that explained the coded recognition system, asking questions about how the network had operated. An elderly black woman approached Chen and introduced herself as Martha Freeman Washington, a descendant of Delilah. She'd traveled from Philadelphia for the opening. "Thank you for telling her story," Martha said quietly. "My family always knew Delilah had escaped from slavery, but we didn't know about the network or the photographs or what she'd done to help others. This makes her real in a way family stories never could." Chen felt the weight of that responsibility. Making people real, giving them substance beyond mythology, documenting their choices and their consequences. The exhibition ran for 6 months and drew visitors from across the country. Some came out of academic interest. Some came because they were researching their own family histories. Some came because they needed to see proof that resistance had existed, that enslaved people had fought back in whatever ways were available to them. But Chen knew the exhibition was incomplete. The 12 glass plates Martha Wheelwright had hidden represented less than 20% of the network Wheelwright had documented. The other plates, numbers 1 through 18, numbers 28 through 40, numbers 42 through 52, and everything beyond 68, were gone, destroyed in the emergency purge of April 1859, or lost in the chaos of the Civil War. 68 people had been enrolled in this network. Chen had found documentation for 14 of them. The other 54 remained anonymous, their faces destroyed, their names known only to Thomas Garrett and to the people who'd worked alongside them. Chen thought about those missing people often. The conductors who'd transported fugitives north, the safe house operators who'd sheltered people at enormous personal risk, the operatives who'd remained enslaved while helping others escape, the fugitives who'd trusted this system enough to study coded gestures and memorize faces they'd never seen in person. They'd all made choices, they'd all taken risks, and most of them had vanished from the historical record completely. She thought about Grace especially. Grace Wilson, who'd stayed at Isaac Wilson's farm even when escape was possible, who'd helped dozens of people flee while remaining behind herself, who'd lived into the 1880s as a free woman, but had left almost no trace of her life before emancipation. What had Grace thought about during those years between 1854 and 1865? Had she regretted staying? Had she wished she'd run with Delilah? Or had she believed the work was important enough to justify the sacrifice? Chen would never know. The interior lives of enslaved people were deliberately hidden, protected by silence and misdirection that kept white owners and overseers from understanding what the people they claimed to own were actually thinking and feeling. But the photograph remained. Grace's face captured on glass, her hands folded in a gesture that meant something to people who knew how to read it. She'd chosen to be visible in that moment. She'd let Wheelwright document her involvement. And even though most of the context had been lost, even though her later life was poorly documented, The photograph insisted she'd existed. She'd mattered. She'd done something that required courage. Chen's research had generated new questions for other historians. How many other photographers had participated in similar networks? Had the system extended beyond the Charleston-Philadelphia corridor into other regions? How many enslaved people had used photographic identification to facilitate their escapes? Graduate students were writing dissertations on these questions. Archives were being searched for additional documentation. Slowly, piece by piece, a more complete picture of underground railroad networks was emerging. But Chen knew they'd never find everyone. The system had been designed to be invisible. Records had been deliberately destroyed. People had changed their names and disappeared into new lives after emancipation. The historical record would always have gaps, silences where stories should be. She thought about the families who descended from Underground Railroad participants and didn't know it. The people walking around with no idea their ancestors had risked everything to help strangers escape. The comfortable lies that persisted because documentation had been destroyed. And she thought about the responsibility of historians to tell the truth even when it was uncomfortable, to name names when possible, to honor silence when necessary, to acknowledge both the heroism and the complicity, both the resistance and the collaboration. 3 women in borrowed silk dresses, hands folded in coded gestures, a number etched into glass. The photograph had survived 170 years. It had outlasted slavery, outlasted the people who created it, outlasted the network it documented, and it continued to speak, if you knew how to listen. The glass plate negative sits in climate-controlled storage at the Charleston Museum, archived under accession number 2019.2 Fort Devon. Researchers can request access with proper credentials. The image has been digitized and is available online through the museum's collection database. Delilah Freeman is buried in Philadelphia's Eden Cemetery. Her gravestone identifies her as mother, seamstress, and friend to many. Her descendants hold family reunions every summer. Patience's fate remains unknown. She may have escaped to the north, changed her name, built a life outside the historical record. Or she may have been caught, sold, punished for her involvement with the network. The silence that protected her in life has obscured her in death. Grace Wilson lived in Guilford County, North Carolina, until at least 1880. After that, she disappears from census records and land deeds. She left no known descendants and no written account of her work with the Underground Railroad. But people in Greensboro still tell stories about a woman who stayed when she could have run, who helped others escape while remaining behind, who understood that sometimes freedom means choosing the work over the reward. Dr. Sarah Chen teaches at Duke University and continues researching photographic networks in the antebellum South. She receives emails regularly from people who found old portraits in attic boxes and want to know if the hand positions mean something. Usually they don't. But sometimes, once or twice a year, someone sends her an image that makes her pause, examine the fingers, check the positioning against the codes documented in Thomas Garrett's ledger. And sometimes, the gestures match. On quiet nights, when tour groups have gone home and the Charleston Museum has locked its doors, security cameras record empty galleries where photographs hang on walls. 3 women in borrowed silk dresses, hands folded just so. Watching from the past, waiting to be recognized, insisting that their story, incomplete, fragmentary, reconstructed from glass and cipher, and the stubborn refusal to let truth be destroyed, still matters. Some secrets survive because someone decides they're worth protecting. Some voices echo because someone refuses to let them be silenced. And some gestures, made in Charleston in June 1854 by three women who had every reason to stay invisible, speak across 170 years with perfect clarity. We were here. We resisted. We helped others. Remember us. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.